This is This Week Explained, your weekly update from behind the front lines. I'm Tiana, and with me is my co-host Kervin. And in a world of biased, politically motivated reporting, we try to cut through the noise to bring you factual, actual intelligence. Before we get into the episode this week, though, we need to do a little housekeeping. You're going to notice some subtle changes as we move to becoming the source for factual reporting, cutting through the noise of biased, politically motivated reporting. We're moving away from broad advertisements to a much leaner, more curated ad program. And what does that mean for you? Hopefully, fewer ad breaks, but more importantly, the ads you do hear will be from a list we've personally curated. We don't want to inundate you, but ads are how we pay for our gear, our software, and how we get past those news paywalls. It's all so that you, the listener, can get the best experience with the most accurate news. We also want to remind you that we're part of the amazing Leon Media Network. The LMN isn't just news, it's sports, education, and entertainment. So check out their amazing podcasts like Can We Please Talk, At Least You Heard It Here, and Back Your Play at leonmedianetwork.com. We're so glad that you're here with us. Now, on with the update. This week, we're tracking the world stretched to a breaking point, a moment defined by a volatile friction between the fragile structures of stability and the raw projection of power that threatens to shatter them. In Europe, this tension is exploding in eastern Ukraine. This is not a symbolic fight. We focus on the city of Pokrovsk, a genuinely strategic target that serves as the last gateway to the Donbas. We'll examine the brutal urban warfare where elite forces are outnumbered 8-1, and a whack-a-mole strategy on the front line highlights Ukraine's desperate manpower crisis. This is a battle as much about political narrative as it is about territory, with fears that troops may be sacrificed to counter a Russian on-the-march narrative. This immense strain on the battlefield is creating tremors that reach the very top of the Kremlin. We'll look at the first public-facing denials of a rift between President Putin and his two-decade foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. We unpack the rumors of disastrous calls and canceled summits, and the hard evidence of Lavrov's mysterious absence from key meetings, a potentially seismic signal of instability. In Gaza, a fragile peace holds on, but its survival hinges on an impossible dilemma: Hamas's disarmament. For Israel, it's non-negotiable. For Hamas, it's an existential unraveling. We dive into the massive contradictions between a U.S. envoy claiming a guns for butter deal is done and the realities on the ground. And we'll hear from a former head of Israel, Shin Bet, who calls the plan Swiss cheese and warns that without a credible political horizon, the war is simply a massive recruitment drive for the next generation of militants. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these hot wars, a different kind of power projection is playing the long game. We turn to the Western Balkans, where China is not disrupting but systematically building dependency. We'll track how Beijing is using Serbia as an ironclad partner to export its authoritarian tech model, installing blacklisted safe city cameras and surveillance architecture, while simultaneously becoming Europe's #1 supplier of advanced military hardware to a key NATO partner. Finally, we turn to the place where all diplomacy has collapsed. In Sudan, the fall of Fasher has triggered a catastrophic new phase of violence. We'll cover the harrowing reports of massacres, the deliberate man-made famine, and the complete failure of international aid in what the UN is calling an intolerable carnage fueled by external powers. It's a world of desperate holds and long-term infiltration. As always, we are going to start in Ukraine and focus on the front lines, where an immense amount of firepower is being concentrated on one small city. So, Kervin, the fighting has become pretty brutal, and it's a grinding war of attrition, but this battle seems different, like it feels like a focal point.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a focal point, and we're talking about Pokrovsk. That is a region, and that's a small town in the Donetsk region. And what is critical to understand is why it matters. So you're going to remember earlier that we saw the fight for Bakhmut. This was a long, terrible siege started by the Russians. But in that case, the strategic value of the city was quite debated. It was, for many, a symbolic battle.
This is not that.
Yeah, this is definitely not that. Pokrovsk is a genuinely strategic target. It is, or at least it was, a major railroad and road hub. Now, from a military logistics standpoint, it is the last major obstacle standing between Russian forces and the last two large fortress cities Ukraine holds in the Donbas region. That's Sloviansk and Kramatorsk.
So this is the gateway?
Yeah, absolutely. If Russia takes these two northern cities, they effectively control the Donbass, which has been a primary objective from the very beginning.
The reports coming out of the city are harrowing. President Zelensky claimed that nearly one-third of all battles along the entire front and half of all glide bomb attacks are focused right there. We can't independently confirm those numbers, but they paint a picture of the intensity at the very least. So, what are we seeing on the ground?
We're seeing a shift in tactics to start. So the reporting indicates Russia's been infiltrating fighters, perhaps 1,000 or so, into the city center in very small groups. They're trying to establish these islands of control, which they can then reinforce with armor and force an actual Ukrainian withdrawal.
And how is Ukraine responding to that?
Yeah, well, they're committing their elite special forces. That's to include the Azov Brigade. What they're doing here is they want to engage in what is now incredibly difficult urban warfare. They have to clear these Russian forces from a landscape that has been almost entirely turned to rubble. The pre war population of the area was around 60,000. It's now estimated at fewer than 1,300, and that should tell you everything you need to know about the devastation there.
This sounds like a desperate fight.
And it is, and it highlights Ukraine's single biggest problem. They have a lack of numbers. The front line has become this, like you mentioned at the beginning, this game of whack a mole. Ukraine moves its best units in order to plug a hole, and Russia, which has the advantage in manpower, simply exploits the new gap left behind.
President Zelensky said his forces are outnumbered 8-1 in that area.
Exactly, and this seems to be what happened. Ukraine apparently moved units away from Pokrovsk to counter a different Russian advance. That is when the situation in the city began to deteriorate. Some analysts are putting the chances of Ukraine holding the city at about 50-50, maybe a little bit less than that, and it's very close. Like I said, I assess that it is unlikely, but not highly unlikely, that Ukraine can hold their ground unless drastic changes happen in the very near future.
And there is a political layer to this as well, is there not? This battle seems to be as much about narrative as it is about the territory.
Yeah, absolutely. This would be the largest city to fall since Bakhmut, well over a year ago. Now, for the Kremlin, a victory here would aid their narrative that Russia is on the march and that the war will only get worse for Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian president has even said he believes Russia is pushing this hard in this area to demonstrate battlefield success, specifically for U.S. President Donald Trump.
And for Ukraine, holding on is about countering that narrative, especially as they seek more support from what the source material described as a fickle Trump administration.
Yeah, and that leads to a dangerous dynamic here. There are real fears being voiced that Ukraine might wait too long to retreat. They're going to sacrifice troops for political reasons. And this is a criticism that we've seen in past battles. We saw that with Avdiivka. Now, the cost for Russia to achieve these gains has also been very immense. The casualty figures cannot be confirmed, but they are staggering. But look, Russia is still advancing.
All of this pressure on the battlefield must be creating intense strain within Moscow. So I want to pivot to the Kremlin itself because there's some fascinating rumors circulating about President Putin and one of his most senior longstanding figures.
Yeah, this is a very interesting signal that came out this week. The Kremlin was forced to come out and publicly deny a rift between Russian President Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov.
Lavrov has been in that post since 2004. So he's had that post as long as our oldest has been alive.
Yes. It's a long
He
time.
it yeah, he is one of the foundations of Putin's foreign policy. So what is the source of all of these rumors?
Well, the Moscow Times published a report alleging a disastrous call between Lavrov and the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And it was this supposed call, um, the report claims, that was immediately followed by new U.S. sanctions and very significantly, if you remember, the cancellation of that planned meeting between Putin and Donald Trump.
Yikes, that is quite the claim. Is there anything tangible fueling this speculation, or is it just palace intrigue?
Yeah, well, analysts are pointing to two very specific and unusual events. First, Lavrov, who's a permanent member of Russia's Security Council, was actually absent from its Wednesday meeting. And the other, perhaps more telling concern here is the Kremlin announced that Lavrov would not be heading the Russian delegation at the upcoming G20 summit.
That is a major break in precedent, but the fact they had to address it is also quite notable, is it not?
Yeah, it's extremely notable, both the fact that they had to address it and that they actually did address it. We both know Russia does not like to address internal feuds publicly. So any perceived instability or change with a figure like Lavrov, who has been the face of Russian diplomacy for 2 decades, that's going to be a seismic event.
So we're seeing a critical, grinding battle on the front that is as much about political narrative as it is about strategic territory. And at the same time, we are seeing the first public facing denials of instability at the very top of the Kremlin. It really shows the intense strain on both systems. Now, I want to turn our attention to the next phase of the US led peace initiative for Gaza. Now that a ceasefire is holding and we have seen the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners, the negotiations have entered a much more complex stage. All the focus now seems to be on one critical issue, and that is the demand for Hamas to surrender its weapons.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Sienna. And it's not just a sticking point, it is the fundamental dilemma of this entire process. Now, from the Israeli perspective, this is completely non negotiable. The trauma of the October 7th attacks has unified the country on this one singular point: Hamas cannot be allowed to retain its arsenal.
But for Hamas, that demand is not just a tactical concession, is it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right again. It's an existential concession, they would say. This is a group whose entire identity, its political legitimacy, and its historical narrative are built around the concept of armed resistance. The opinion pieces and analyses that we are seeing suggest that for them, giving up their weapons is not just surrender, it is an existential unraveling. It cuts to the core of who they really are.
So we have an irresistible force meeting an immovable object.
Absolutely. There is an optimistic view that Hamas will eventually comply out of pure pragmatism, that it's going to accept a weakened political role as the only alternative to another devastating war. But the more likely outcome, from those of us who have studied this group, is that they simply will not fully relinquish their arms.
And yet, we are hearing reports this week from the U.S. Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, that seem to contradict this entirely. He claims that this is almost a done deal.
Yeah, he does. Witkoff stated that in a meeting he and Jared Kushner had with Hamas officials, this was just hours before the ceasefire was signed, Hamas leadership privately told them they would disarm.
That is a blockbuster claim. So, what is the context here?
I think the context is development. Wickoff is linking this alleged promise to a development plan for Gaza, one that includes what he probably is quoting Trump as saying is a tremendous jobs program. Now, the implication is that this is a guns for butter trade on a massive scale.
I could hear Trump's voice saying
Yeah.
tremendous jobs program. I could hear it.
Yeah.
Pathetic.
Yes.
Well, I mean, obviously this sounds incredibly optimistic, especially after, Hamas drawing that hard line earlier in the conflict saying we aren't going to disarm. So, does that claim hold up against what we are hearing from other channels?
Look, there are some significant contradictions that we're hearing. First, we have Hamas's public statements. They're to the complete opposite of all of this. They have either insisted they will not disarm or have simply dodged the question altogether.
And privately?
Well, if you trust the reporting, privately, the narrative is a bit different as well. Arab diplomats familiar with the talks have indicated that Hamas has shown openness to giving up its heavy weaponry, those missiles, the RPGs, things like that. But they actually want to hold on to their lighter arms, the rifles and handguns that they own.
So, is that still a non-starter for Israel, or could you see a scenario where Israel says light arms are fine, but not medium or long-range heavy weapons?
Yeah, absolutely not. And this is because it was the light arms. Those were the same weapons that were used in the October 7th attacks. And they are also the weapons Hamas uses to maintain its internal control over the Strip. So that distinction, I think, is likely meaningless to Israel.
There is another major disconnect in the envoy's report, is there not? Something about an international force?
Right. Yeah. And then this is perhaps the biggest gap. So Witkoff says the U.S. is, quote, in the middle of standing up a decommissioning process, end quote. And he crucially said that Hamas has always said it would need an international security force to come in and be the layer they hand their weapons to.
But Hamas has consistently and repeatedly come out against any foreign troops entering Gaza.
Exactly. The two positions are diametrically opposed. Witkoff says he hopes to stand this force up in the next 3 weeks and that it will be the, quote, inflection point, end quote, to see if anyone does what they said they would do. So it's a very public facing, high stakes claim. It does not seem to align with the data coming from the ground or actually data coming from the regional partners.
This gap between the political negotiation and the practical reality brings me to the recent analysis from the former head of Israel's Shin Bet, one of the, quote, legendary gatekeepers, end quote, of the country's intelligence apparatus. He is deeply pessimistic about this whole plan.
Yeah, he is. He's taking Tiana's role in this, and his perspective is actually quite vital because he's not a politician. He's a practitioner. He famously led the Shin Bet in the years after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. He's also credited with modernizing it, and he uh, he was quoted as saying that the Trump plan has more holes than Swiss cheese, and that's a quote from him.
And what does he identify as the biggest hole in this Swiss cheese plan?
Yeah. I would say it's the lack of a clear political horizon, specifically the lack of a firm, credible commitment to that two-state solution.
So, why is that so central for him?
Well, he bases this on his own experience. He explained that his success in preventing attacks in the 1990s was down to close coordination with the Palestinian Authority. He says they told him, "We are not your agents. We only do this because our people believe at the end of the day, we will have a state beside Israel."
So, without that hope, there is no cooperation.
Well, without that hope, there is no incentive, I think. He believes the chances of Hamas disarming are negligible if there is no political endgame for the Palestinian people. This is also the position of the Palestinian Authority. This is the sticking point. Israel insists the Palestinian Authority should not run post war Gaza, but Palestinian leaders and Muslim countries say that they must.
He also spoke about the fundamental goal of the war, this idea of, quote, vanquishing Hamas, end quote.
Yeah, what's funny is here he actually mocks it. He says, and I'll quote him here, quote, "What is Hamas all about? It is a radical Muslim organization with a military wing," end quote. And his point is that you can defeat the military wing on the battlefield, but as we have said on this very podcast, you cannot defeat its ideology with military power.
All right, yeah, we have definitely said that several times. So essentially, He is saying that you need a better idea, not just a stronger military.
Yeah, and for him and many other former, quote, gatekeepers, end quote, the gatekeepers of the Israeli security establishment, that better idea is an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. His greatest worry right now is that the brutality and trauma of this war are just acting as a massive recruitment drive for Hamas, not to mention for other global jihadi groups.
So we have this triangle of pressure. The US is pushing a plan, Israel is demanding disarmament, but what about the internal pressures on Hamas? You mentioned they use light weapons to maintain control. So what happens inside Gaza if they actually do disarm?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think this is part of that existential dilemma that we started this topic off with. This is not about just Israel. Hamas violently ousted Fatah from Gaza and has ruled through a security apparatus built on loyalty and force. So if it loses its monopoly on force, the fear is profound internal chaos. They fear rivals like Fatah or even powerful clans like the Dagmush would be emboldened and they would seek revenge. So disarmament could very well lead to internal collapse.
Well, this all paints a very, very difficult picture. We have a U.S. envoy claiming a deal is done. We have intelligence veterans saying that very deal is impossible without a two-state solution. And we have Hamas facing either destruction from Israel or internal chaos if it complies. Okay, but Kervin, is a two-state solution even viable anymore?
Yeah, and look, that is another great question. It's the final and perhaps largest hurdle that they're going to face. So the position of security stalwarts is now at odds with public opinion on both sides of this. There was a recent Gallup poll this from this past September, and it showed only 27% of Israelis actually back a two-state solution. 63% oppose it. But get this, the skepticism is mutual. There are fundamental trust issues in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Only about 1 in 3 Palestinians support a two state solution. 55% oppose it. So both publics, as the data shows, have lost faith in the very idea.
That's some very interesting data. I mean, the media headlines have been awash with approval for a two-state solution. Western powers like the UK and Canada even voted in favor of it, yet it is the very solution both publics reject. That sounds like a complete dead end.
Yeah, it does, but that doesn't mean opinions can't change. Look, most Israelis were also deeply suspicious of the Egypt Israel peace treaty back in 1979. I think what is needed now are some great gestures from the leaders of both parties, similar to what happened in 1979. And I think I really believe that that would actually be the first step on this long journey of peace.
A journey of 1,000 miles, as they say. I think this highlights a critical disconnect between high level deal making and the deep rooted realities on the ground. So we'll certainly have to watch that inflection point Steve Witkoff mentioned. We are about to pivot to the Western Balkans, but first I want to give a huge thank you to the folks powering today's episode, Fresh Roasted Coffee. They make it possible for us to bring you this deep dive analysis each week. And if you're like me, you know that a truly great cup of coffee is essential for processing this much information. That is what fresh roasted coffee is all about. This isn't coffee that's been sitting on a shelf for months. They roast your beans to order so it arrives at your door at absolute peak freshness. But it's not just when they roast, it's how and what they roast. Their entire production facility is powered by renewable energy gathered on site. They source specialty grade USDA organic beans, meaning you're getting a cleaner, better tasting, and more sustainable cup of coffee every single time. It's high quality, ethically sourced, and roasted with precision. They've set up a special offer just for our listeners. To get the best deal, you must click the link in our show notes and enter the code this week. That's THISWEEK to get 20% off your first order. It's genuinely some of the best coffee you can buy, and you'll be supporting the show, so check it out if you have a moment. Now, as we mentioned before, we are shifting our focus to the Balkans. And when we discuss geopolitical friction in the Western Balkans, the conversation almost always defaults to Russia. We talk about disinformation, energy politics, historical ties, but there is another major power operating in that space, one that is playing a completely different game, and that is our old pals, China.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Tiana. And the distinction there is critical. So if we look at Russia's methodology, it often employs disruptive active measures. We're talking cyber attacks, proxies, concerted disinformation campaigns. It is designed to fracture and then disrupt.
Which is very immediate, very overt, correct?
Yeah, it is. China is very different. They employ what analysts call sharp power. This is a much longer term strategy. So it's not about disruption. This is all about dependency. Think the Belt and Road Initiative. China is blending operational domains, defense, technology, and infrastructure to uh, methodically entrench itself and expand its influence in Europe.
And it seems they have found a very willing partner to help them. The commentary we are looking at refers to Serbia as an, quote, ironclad strategic partner, end quote. Why the heck Serbia?
Yeah, I think there's several reinforcing reasons here. First, Belgrade views Beijing as a dependable partner that does not interfere in its domestic politics. Imagine that, a country
Yet,
that doesn't want to.
yet, they don't, they need to change
Right.
that to yet.
Yeah. But they are. Yeah, they aren't doing it yet. Right. So they view Beijing as dependable. We know to the contrary. History tells us, but as of right now, there are no lectures on governance or human rights from an outside country, a novel idea in geopolitics today. Second, China's political positions align with Serbia's. Now, China opposes Kosovo's sovereignty. This is a core issue for Belgrade. And also, China objected to the 1999 NATO intervention. That creates a deep political resonance.
And what's the third reason?
Uh, One word, diversification. This reflects Serbia's longstanding tradition of balancing East and West. So, by building this relationship, Belgrade diversifies its strategic partnerships beyond its traditional reliance on Western sources and, of course, relying on Russia.
All right, well, let's break that down. I want to split this into two major domains. So let's start with the military component. How deep is this defense relationship?
Look, it is substantial. Serbia is now China's primary military client in all of Europe. We're not talking about small arms. China is supplying Serbia with medium range air defense missile systems, advanced combat drones, and guided missiles. This is a these are high level pieces of hardware.
So is this purely a buyer seller relationship?
No, actually, it has evolved beyond that. It includes technology transfers for sophisticated domestic projects. But China is actively assisting Serbia in developing its own intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, drone capabilities. This is paired with joint military exercises and training Serbian crews on these new Chinese air defense systems. So this is an integration.
But Kervin, Serbia still works with NATO, and we know it is a member of the Partnership for Peace. So how do they, reconcile that?
Yeah, it's just balance, I guess. That partnership with NATO is pragmatic. It's focused on interoperability for things like peacekeeping operations. But these commitments are non binding. The risk from a Western standpoint is that as Serbia integrates Chinese defense technology, it creates technological dependencies that could, over time, directly undercut its interoperability with NATO.
That seems to be the perfect pivot to the second domain, which is technology and surveillance. This is where that sharp power concept really seems to take shape.
Yeah, this is the core of the long term dependency. Huawei, a company we discuss often, is a massive player in the digital transformation of the Western Balkans, especially in Serbia. We are seeing widespread, what are being called, quote, safe city, end quote, projects.
Safe city projects, what does that even mean in practical terms?
Yeah, it means thousands of smart cameras, often from firms like Hikvision and Dawa, companies the U.S. has blacklisted over security risks. These are being installed across Serbia, and these systems feed into law enforcement databases for automated public monitoring. China is also helping to build out the national data centers, the artificial intelligence platforms, and the cloud storage for state utilization.
So, China is building the entire surveillance and data architecture in Serbia.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, and that is a scary thought. It's not just happening within Serbia's recognized borders either. The analysis I have read points to reports of Serb police and parallel structures installing these same blacklisted Chinese cameras in the north of Kosovo to monitor public spaces, and this circumvents Kosovo's original official police.
It sounds like an export of a technological and authoritarian model. So, how is this being sold to the public?
I think through a very coordinated information campaign, something China is good at. Chinese state media outlets are pushing preferred content, reinforcing the narrative of Beijing as a reliable, benign, non interventionist partner. They have media sharing agreements with local outlets, and they use academic exchanges like the Confucius Institutes. This promotes state friendly narratives and it downplays concerns about transparency or human rights.
This sounds incredibly entrenched. If you are the US or NATO, how do you even begin to counter this? You can't just tell them to unplug it all.
Yeah, you really can't. And you can't simply try to outspin Beijing. The proposed Western response is less about matching dollar for dollar and more about changing the rules of the competition.
How so?
Although the primary tool suggested is transparency. The West should push these governments to adopt open contracting data standards, something called OCDS. This is based on Ukraine's Prozoro system, which recently had very remarkable success.
Okay, explain that. How does a data standard compete with a combat drone?
Yeah, it competes by targeting the vulnerability that China exploits. China often leverages opaque state led deals that are susceptible to corruption and elite capture. OCDS digitizes the entire public procurement process. It puts tenders, bids, contracts into the public domain where they can be scrutinized by watchdogs.
So it levels the playing field.
Yeah, exactly. It makes it much harder for these politically driven deals to survive. It forces the competition to be about technical merit, quality, and most importantly, compliance, specifically compliance with NATO standards. It shifts the benchmark from political access, where China has an edge, to quality and interoperability, where Western firms would be preferred.
So the Western response is fundamentally about governance.
Yeah, it is. It is about governance, and it's also about providing credible alternatives. The US and the European Union must provide viable financing for infrastructure and defense using frameworks like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure. They can offer modular NATO training packages as substitutes for these Chinese systems. Now, without the transparency of open contracting, Western money can just as easily get lost in these same corrupt systems we see around the world. So, the OCDS model is the mechanism to ensure that Western investment actually builds resilience.
It is a fascinatingly asymmetric response, using transparency as a strategic tool to counter technological and financial influence. a true governance based defense. So we will have to track if those open contracting standards gain any real traction. It is certainly a long term play. So now we are going to pivot slightly because, Kervin, we have to talk about Sudan. The reports I'm seeing are on honestly they're devastating. The United Nations Secretary General used the phrase, quote, spiraling out of control, end quote. That is not language they use lightly.
No, it really isn't. That is diplomatic language for a complete breakdown of order. The situation has been deteriorating for a long time. This war's been raging since April 2023. But this latest development is a critical and I would say terrible turning point.
You are talking about the fall of El Fasher in North Darfur. For listeners who are just catching up, can you place this single event into the larger context of the war?
Yeah, absolutely. This was not just a battle, this was the culmination of an 18-month siege. The paramilitary group, the RSF, has now broken through the Sudanese military's defenses and they have taken the city. A single victory like this can reshape this entire conflict. And in this case, it appears to be inciting a new, even more catastrophic phase of violence.
And as always, the civilians are the ones caught in the middle. The displacement numbers are staggering over 14 million people. We're talking about one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet.
And the reports coming out of El Fasher itself are horrific. We're hearing about widespread, systematic violence against civilians. Rights groups are characterizing it as a massacre. The International Criminal Court has already announced it is collecting evidence of mass killings and rapes.
The International Criminal Court that's more symbolic than anything else. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
now they're doing the research, though.
Okay. It's almost unbelievable. And the RSF.
Well, the RSF, for the record, is denying that it is committing these atrocities, but the volume of reports, and I'd also say the satellite data and the witness testimony, those are painting a very clear, very dark picture.
And the violence is not the only weapon being used. I was reading about the food situation. This is something else.
Yeah, it is. This is a siege tactic. So during the siege, locals reported that RSF troops were targeting community kitchens. They were actively destroying the food supply. People were forced to eat animal feed. Some were even eating animal hides. And now, the world's leading hunger monitor, the IPC, has made an official determination.
I'll go out on a very stable limb here and say they determined what is happening in El Fasher is a famine.
Yep, you're exactly right. And that's not a word that they use until the criteria uh, are undeniable. This is the first time they've had to make that determination for the city itself, though they had already declared it for a displacement camp that was nearby. This is a deliberate, man-made famine. And it's not just El Fasher. The townspeople are fleeing. The people are fleeing to. Those are also now at risk of famine.
So you have this massive crisis. More than 21 million people across the country facing acute food insecurity, the largest such crisis in the entire world. And the UN is calling for a ceasefire. So why is it so difficult to stop? If everyone sees this intolerable carnage, why does it continue?
Yeah, because as we've seen in multiple global hotspots, war is really just a local fight. This one is the same. So outside parties continue to supply weapons to both the warring sides. So when you have external actors fueling the conflict, that ceasefire is almost impossible. Neither side has an incentive, neither side has a reason to stop fighting as long as the weapons and money keep flowing.
Do you know who is responsible for funding both sides? Or no, you don't have the
Yeah,
information.
there's a few. So a lot of it is like Eastern European weapons suppliers. You can put Russia into there. Um, China has supplied some weapons, so it's coming from multiple angles. and it is to keep the fighting going. Why? Because Sudan has some resources that other harbingers or other powers want to get into so that they can take that freely.
That's gross. But anyways, that leads us to the other side of the failure, which is the humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, and that has completely dried up now. It's completely dried up. The humanitarian plan for Sudan requires over $4 billion. This year has received only 28% of that. Remember, I said this was going on for 18 months now. Now, donor governments are pulling back on aid expenditures at the exact moment the need is highest.
It is a perfect storm of failure. It appears Fasher is not just a humanitarian emergency, it is the face of the broader collapse of international diplomacy in the post World War II era, a collapse of international diplomacy. That is a heavy, heavy charge. All right, Carvin, as we close out, is there anything else that you want to discuss?
Yes. So this episode, after it comes out, you'll probably already see the video of me on NTD. But also, I just want to say Happy Veterans Day to everyone who will be celebrating. Hopefully, we get to celebrate as well. We'll see if the world lets us do that, Tiana. But just wanted to say those two things. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
I want to say that I am so excited that Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz are teaming up again for another Mummy movie. We can just pretend that the third one never happened.
Did you
That's it.
see the tote bags that were created?
No?
The third mummy doesn't exist.
No, I haven't seen those at all. But yeah,
Yeah, I think they're doing a campaign plan.
that was really happy news for me. So I think that's about it. I don't think we have anything. Nobody's had a birthday. I don't think we have any holidays. I mean, obviously, happy Veterans Day. Thank you, veterans, for everything you have done. And yeah, that's it, I guess.
I'm with you on that. That's all I got.
Yeah, we're not gonna talk y'all's ears off any longer. Let you go do what you gotta do for the end of the weekend. Get ready for the week. So, thank you for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we would love to hear from you. For more in depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.